Okay, thank you everybody for coming tonight. As Tim said, for those of you who don't know, my name is Garrett Vitanza, and I'm the principal instructor here at the Academy of Realist Art Boston. And so tonight we're going to be discussing, well, a Michelangelo, and a famous one, but maybe not in the way that you think. So this is Michelangelo Merisi di Caravaggio. So Caravaggio was actually originally, this is his name, Michelangelo Merisi, but just like Leonardo da Vinci from the town of Vinci, Caravaggio became synonymous with his town. It also helps historians differentiate which Mikey they're talking about as well. And so this is him. So this is Michelangelo Merisi. He is born in 1571. He is orphaned by the age of 12, I believe. His grandfather and father die on the same day. The plague is something that was known to take people, unfortunately, with very high numbers. And this is, yeah, so he is obviously, as you might assume, with the value structure, it might be a little hard to see some things. But the reason I wanted to pick up our conversation from the last one with Caravaggio, anyway, so Caravaggio really introduces a whole new style of painting in Western art. And the ripple effects of which are actually still felt today in the language of painting, and we'll actually be seeing how that relates to our day-to-day work. So I'm going to be calling him. Caravaggio, really, it's really hard to. So right now in our present day, we're so comfortable with images with such dynamism and such high sense of drama and emotion, but this was really shocking to the average public at this time. This kind of, the amount of nudity, of course, we're dealing at a time of high religiosity where there's a certain extreme sense of modesty. And so actually, just a quick side note here, compositionally speaking. So if you guys look at the figures that are on the left-hand side, starting with this man that's reclining, working all the way back to the very far figure on the far left, that is actually Caravaggio himself in the very far back, kind of looking on with an indifference onto the situation, actually turning away to exit scene, stage left here. But if you look at the cluster of figures beyond that, he's using a compositional device that called, well, I don't know if it's officially called this, but I call animation, where if you look at the figure on the bottom and you look at the figure above and so on, it almost looks like a neon sign animating the acting of rising or falling. So Caravaggio is playing with a sculptural space and is using this compositional device to help, in some practical ways, help figure out how to arrange figures in a pleasing way to focus the attention on the center, which of course is the assassination of St. Matthew. And of course here, very contrary to the common depiction, Caravaggio makes the executioner, not the saint, the focal point of this image, but we will come back to that in a little bit. So just to pick up a little bit of where we left off in our last discussion and to catch up people who may not have joined in there, we last were discussing the Renaissance both north and south of the Alps, and we were discussing how, well, to kind of summarize things, with the application and the reemergence of classical canons being applied to the introduction of one-point perspective, as well as the advances in humanism, which is basically the study of the human condition outside of church dogma, to kind of summarize that very simply. But as we look at this, it is grounded in our language of reality. Like, I believe that there is a singular light source, there is a sense of reality to this. But at the same time, there's a distance. Like, I would not believe you if you told me this was a photograph, for example. But it is a truth that is grounded in our reality, but it is elevated. It is nature perfected. Human nature being the highest fulfillment of nature itself, and art being the highest form of human nature. This is a very kind of, well, Greek philosophy, really. So the figures have a certain sense of realness, but an idealized realness, not a very tangibility, or not much of a tangibility to them, I should say. And this is what Caravaggio does a few decades later. And immediately you were struck by what we would call the posterization, or that immediate grabbing effect that the image has because of Caravaggio's masterful use of dynamic value contrast And again, if you look at the composition and you look at the woman in the very far right whose hands are upraised, if you look kind of at the figures below, especially with the man with his hand outstretched, again, there's a little bit of this sense of animation, like almost you can read her throwing her arms up in a wail as she's lamenting. And this Christ here, this is a dead body, unlike the Raphael previously. If I were to, this is again and appropriately so, a deified kind of human body. It's kind of perfected of all imperfections, and it's almost looks like it's made of marble rather than flesh. And that's one of Caravaggio's incredible contributions to the Western language of painting. One of the other things that Caravaggio is also playing with is his control of values through the technique of foreshortening, which I know a lot of you who I've worked with have had the privilege of being challenged by. And here, there are the two moments where Caravaggio is really challenging you, and this is what makes Caravaggio so important. His realism is aggressive, and it kind of crashes in and forces its way into our reality, almost like sculpture does. But in this particular, the elbow of the man holding Christ's knees is jetting into our space, and Caravaggio is very conscious to make sure that that elbow is illuminated. The edges of shadow around are heightened with black glazes, and the edges on the elbow are sharpened. If you then look at the wrinkles up towards the shoulder, he is lessening the value difference, therefore helping the belief that the shoulder goes back into space. That's emphasized by the corner of the tomb at the very base that is also jetting into our space. This is also kind of symbolic, the split, so in the death of Christ, the splitting of kind of heaven and earth, so to speak, as well. So it does have compositional significance for the content, as well as the sign of life, kind of the resurrection to come. But it's really those technical advancements and also the sense of weight on the feet of the man that's holding Christ, and also the literal realness that he depicts with, gets him into trouble, and we'll get into that. We'll come back to that a little bit later as well. So in generations prior, the death of the Virgin, or the death of the mother of Jesus, has been depicted as such. So surrounded by the apostles, and either at the point of death or soon after, where her soul is being welcomed to the Father above. But there is a certain stoicism, distance, and a certain self-consciousness that it is being viewed as a precious object, the best way that I can verbalize that. And with the same subject, so here, actually, a close-up of a more kind of almost slightly Byzantine iconographic version. We can see here that the artist is paying attention to some realism. He is actually representing the Virgin here in a black and white, simulating that of the moment of passing and her heart to stop pumping. But again, there is a certain kind of rigidness to things. So this is Caravaggio's take. This created, we don't know exactly what the details were behind the scandal, but when the friars who commissioned this received it, they were actually very dismayed. And there are a couple different theories that go out there. One is that the model was actually based off of a prostitute, and so that would not be appropriate for someone of this caliber within the church. Another suggestion is that her ankles and some of her legs were revealed, and that was considered to be rather risque for this time. And some have even suggested that the way that she's posed suggests that her belly is somewhat pregnant, although that one I think is a little bit of a stretch. But regardless, they actually rejected the piece. And this is it in its full, so you can see that as a detail of a much larger piece. And Caravaggio is also a master of silence. So much of this painting is not clouded, quite literally, with cherubs and the opening of heaven. It's more the absence, literal death, the absence of light, and just the hint of this, well, not a hint, really, just this huge, almost a large brushwork of crimson fabric. The significance of red is, that of sacrifice, of course, and as you might imagine, has great significance given the context, but seems to almost, in a way, echo or suggest the spirit of the Virgin kind of ascending in a certain manner of speaking, especially with these slightly curved lines ascending upward. So here's a close-up, which I know the image is not so great, but you can also see already Caravaggio's use of the nubby texture of the canvas and how he's using that natural breaking of the paint to help define form. So he's using the texture of the canvas to assist him in his modeling. He's not looking to suppress it to create an enamel-like finish like Van Eyck, for example. So, and again, this is what is making Caravaggio so revolutionary, the dynamism of this presentation of Judith beheading Holofernes. This later starts to influence, as we'll see a little bit later, Caravaggio's followers, but namely Artemisia Gentileschi, who becomes almost known for her depictions of this particular subject. And I mean, it's kind of an argument among titans, but in some respects, I do believe Artemisia is able to capture certain things that Caravaggio, while, I mean, to say expertly rendered is an understatement, does maybe not quite hit the same notes in some respects. But here, again, this kind of characteristic, almost like a branding element, this red fabric kind of up in the upper echelons, which also kind of continues this large diagonal that is then picked up by Judith's sash, if you follow that right across, almost kind of on a large scale signifying the large cut that is being made, which also kind of goes right across if you follow the angle of the knife and the bed sheet that he is pulling up in his struggles. So, and here's another comparison. This is Giovanni Bellini on the left. This is actually a Venetian painter that Dürer was actually, didn't formally study with, but was influenced by him when Dürer went to Venice. And on the right, we have, again, the same subject, a Madonna in child, but through the lens of Caravaggio. And you can just see the dense reality that is accomplished. And that's really and almost solely, although not completely, done by Caravaggio's command of value, the illumination of form amidst dark. Whereas in this time period, in the Renaissance, the real the real kind of new introduction which artists were playing with was the introduction of a vanishing point, that eternal distance that the eye and soul wanders into. And so not so much the effects of light on form. I mean, yes, to an extent, but not to the extent in which Caravaggio did. So like I was saying, Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio is from Caravaggio, and that is just east of Milan. So that kind of magenta dot that you see right there is generally where the town is. So very far up north there. And so he studies with two painters that we know. We have a contract when he is 12 years old and studies for, I believe it's 4 years with Simone Pietrozzano. For any Italian speakers, I apologize ahead of time if I am, butchering your language. And also Giuseppe Cesare, or sometimes referred to as the Cavaliere di Orpino. And so what we know is that for Pietrozzano, he painted heads, and for di Orpino, he painted fruits and flowers. And so these two kind of disciplines together kind of really are what fortifies his training. I believe Pietrozzano was also a fresco painter, so Caravaggio may have had the beginnings of fresco painting training, but never actually became a fresco painter himself. These are some of the works of, this is Simone Pietrozzano, and so you can see already, if you cast your mind back to the Entombment, you can see some of the kind of artistic lineage that he is following, and there are certain similarities. Of course, there's also similarities to the Raphael. There was a certain kind of canonical way of presenting certain subjects. So you can see both Caravaggio's point of influence and departure through the work of his masters. And so we don't really know exactly which heads Caravaggio would have painted, but it is safe to assume that some of the heads that we see in Pietrozzano's work are actually that of Caravaggio. We are also told that Caravaggio was an incredibly fast worker, so brace yourselves, 3 heads a day was what we are told. Really disheartening to read. And so under the tutelage of these two masters, he then starts to produce work for the open market, which was kind of the next step for painters in their typical progression as an apprentice. And so here you can see the culmination of his studies. So really it comes down to the head and the fruits and flowers and objects. So he's presenting, really what he's doing here is a young artist trying to make his mark and demonstrating his skills rather than a complex allegory. Those are for later, when he has harnessed his powers. So here, the convincing realness of the marble, the wood of the violin, not to mention the challenge of perspective of the instruments, the strings, the letterwork, and the notes on the paper, not to mention this convincing bounty of fruits, flowers in a glass vase. So he's really doing everything he can to demonstrate his skill, and beautifully so. This model is actually a man named Mario, no, not Mario, sorry, Mario Meniti, I believe. And he appears in a number of Caravaggio's work. He's a very close friend. In some contexts, he also has been referred to Caravaggio's lover, mostly because in some of the works of the Bacchus, as we will see, there is a certain sensuousness to them. We, of course, can't know for sure, but there is a certain kind of tension between subject and sitter, but that could speak to the relationship or just Caravaggio's mastery of creating the tension. So, again, a close-up of the miraculous detail. So young and yet so confident and so secure in ability. So this, and again, very careful detail here. This also kind of harkens back to our last discussion when we looked at Holbein's The Ambassadors. With all of the objects that separate the two men, there is an instrument with a single broken string. Now that, of course, was speaking to the context of the Anglican Church separating from England and how that was causing an enormous anxiety at that time. Here there is a plucked string, and I think in some that could mean it's somewhat ambiguous, but it does kind of, again, evoke the sense of tension between viewer and subject. And so here are musicians rehearsing. And so again, another demonstration of what Caravaggio is so great at is that, again, there's a sense of animation. The youth in the center here is opening his mouth and is about to sing, or is in the act of singing. His eyes are tearing up from the emotions the music is making him feel. So when you're observing this, it isn't a stagnant image, like it is actually something that you interact with. It is something that there is a dialogue between you and the subject. It is not a form of dictation where it is telling you its meaning. So here again is Mario, and here he is being presented, really just an allegorical figure presenting a basket of fruits. Now, this sometimes is referred to as a Bacchus, which I think I could see very easily why that would be called that. I just don't think we know what a Caravaggio Bacchus looks like, and it has certain trademarks. This, I think, is really just, again, a study, a demonstration in skill. And so again, what is he showing off? His ability to render portraits, hands, and of course, but that enormous bouquet of fruits in the center here. He is said to have said words to the effect of, it takes just as much skill to paint a portrait successfully as it does to paint fruits and flowers successfully. So he somewhat equalized them in difficulty. And even to this day, still life usually is always thought of as the lower echelons of the painting world. It's not thought of as elevated because it doesn't depict the human figure, which in Western art is central. So, and here again is a still life of Caravaggio, and this, of course, again is another demonstration of skill, that he turns what otherwise could be just a very boring arrangement of objects into a life or death drama, and really kind of conveys a certain sense of mortality just with inanimate objects. So if we look at the objects in the center here, not everything is as it seems. The apple on the left is rotted. There's actually a wormhole going through it. The leaves are tattered and in the process of decay in various levels. And he's contrasting that with these kind of rich, supple grapes that feel like they are very ripe and almost about to burst. So he's also playing with the visual language. If we look at it from a larger scale, the left-hand side is darker than the background to its left, and on the right-hand side, the shadow is also darker, so therefore prying the whole thing off. To me, this composition all hangs on the leaves that are on the far right. I feel like the composition depends on the asymmetry, the visual weight that they apply, as it kind of almost, it balances out and kind of responds to the diagonal that is suggested by the twig that's sticking out on the left as well. So, you know, again, another sign of a true master. With just a very simple set of objects, he's able to convey a larger idea. So, and here is a Bacchus, and sometimes this is referred to as a sick Bacchus, because if you do look at the face, there is a little peculiarities to it. It does have a slightly greenish tint to it, and there is a little bit of a sickly pale look to the cheek and to the lips especially. They have sort of a gray red instead of a lively kind of fleshy plush red. I disagree with that, and I will come back to that in a little bit when we start talking about his techniques, but I do disagree with that a little bit. This is also said, one of the, with characters like Caravaggio, where there's not an enormous amount of hard biographical facts, sometimes myth takes the place, and one of the suggestions that's been offered is that Caravaggio was struck by a carriage and while sick and recuperating painted this self-portrait. One of his contemporaries and one of his, a member of the Caravaggisti, which is kind of the group of followers, although they hated each other, and actually they get into a court battle, we'll get into it. And he actually, and this is another Italian word here that I apologize, Giovanni Baglioni, he actually, according to him, Caravaggio did paint this with the mirror. So through his writings, we have the idea that this is actually a self-portrait. I would consider the source, they did not like each other. Not that I think it being a self-portrait lessens its quality, but I think it always just bears worth, considering. So here's a close-up of the portrait to help kind of underline some of those points I was making earlier. So if you look at the lower lip, it doesn't have your typical kind of vermilion red that Caravaggio would use. There's a sickly paleness to the cheek, and again, you can sort of see this mild kind of greeniness around the face, although it is mild. The fingernails also has the dirt or the grime kind of wedged in, which again does kind of put a tick in the box towards it being a self-portrait. As a painter, you would have to grind your pigments almost daily, so you would not be the most cleanly person, especially with the sanitation standards of the day. So, and here's another Bacchus. Again, same time period. And here again, you can see why the earlier painting of the gentleman with the bowl of fruits, I really don't know if I would qualify it as a Bacchus, because you can see the difference here, where this is definitely more, and appropriately so, more of a godlike figure. Now, this is also where you can also understand where some of those interpretations of a certain sexual tension between subject and sitter. There is a certain sensuousness. Bacchus is undoing the knot in his robe, about to undress himself, while he hands you a glass of wine. So there is a certain kind of deliberate interaction there. And again, this is that aggressive realism that forces its way into our reality. The hand even kind of projecting towards us, not kind of being offered to the side, which would be technically a little easier. And to even demonstrate his skill further, the other arm is going back in space. One arm coming forward, one going back, a demonstration of skill. So, and again, if we go back, so if we look at the fruit here, again, the Bacchus, again, not everything is as it seems. There is a dense, natural, observed realism that we're looking at here. So again, the fruit is in various stages of rotting. However, the pomegranate is cracked open, and we can see those really lush, beautiful, like vermilion seeds in there. There is a little bit of iconography here. So the pomegranate traditionally is associated with heaven or eternity, eternal life. And so its presence usually is kind of an indication of that. So one might deduce that the rotting fruit on the left compared to that of the opened pomegranate is a symbol of this kind of unity of the cycle of life of sorts. So he also produces scenes of common day life. And this would be something that Caravaggio would have. I think this is a very cheeky version of it. I think the real version would have been a lot grimier, but this is the sort of lifestyle that Caravaggio would have been more accompanied to. So this is called the Card Sharks. This depicts a rich youth on the left who is being had by the two con men on the right. And so the man in the middle there, it's like if you look up villain in the dictionary, this guy's picture appears to it. He's bug-eyed, kind of like you just know he's up to no good. He has the mittens cut so he can count and feel the trick cards. And he's signaling to his friend the hand so that his he can pull out the correct card in order to cheat. So now in a way, I think this is almost Caravaggio conning the buyers in a way. So he's almost kind of presenting what is quite actually a really quite depressing scene. It is two people surviving by ripping off some other individual, but he's presenting it in a cheeky way, almost like he's presenting his own trick card of sorts. Another demonstration of skill, the chess set that's on the left here, again, a lot of perspective lines on a box in space. So again, a lot of this is a young painter trying to make his mark. And so he actually does. He actually does get patronized by, I'm forgetting his name right now. Oh my gosh. Cardinal, it's escaping me, sorry, I'll come back to that. But under his patronage, he stays at his palace and he starts to produce work that is really quite revelatory. So here we have the story of Doubting Thomas. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the resurrected figure of Christ on the left appears to apostles and tells this to Thomas. He does not believe and says that I will only believe if I can see him myself and stick my fingers in the wounds that killed him. And so here Caravaggio depicts this to us. And I think this is one of his magnum opus, because I think it depicts, if you knew nothing else about Caravaggio and just saw this painting, you would understand all the reasons why he is so championed. So here, Jesus is often referred to as the Word made flesh, this intangible made tangible. And so here, Caravaggio, in this allegory of that, it is a meditation on physicality and the belief of something that is real. He is using this as an essay to talk about the advancements of painting. And so here you can see the finger literally being pushed in. The figure of Christ is actually almost like grabbing his arm and pulling him in deeper so that he believes. You can see that Caravaggio has paid very close attention. We don't know exactly what the references were, but you can see that that does feel like, as morbid as it sounds, a flap of flesh opening up. So we believe, he's making us believe that he has this ability to conjure realism. So whereas Raphael and artists of the past were conjuring ideals from sketches and references, Caravaggio is using live models and is completing paintings piece by piece. This is very revolutionary for this time. I know that by today's standards it feels very standard, but he is working from live models and uncompromisingly recording the reality of who they are and what they look like, quite literally warts and all. To him, this was almost kind of at the heart of what at the time the Christian doctrine was preaching, that there is a kind of the density of the realism here serves as kind of almost a stand-in for the figure of Christ, that intangible made tangible, not through flesh, but through paint. So here you can see almost on the forehead, you could almost see the brushstrokes that are creating the individual wrinkles of Thomas as he kind of is acting surprised as his fingers kind of are going into the wound. Over to the right-hand side, you can also see again, with the man in the back, you can see these kind of freely painted strokes on the forehead, which are really white, but we'll get into that in a little bit, and in which on top of he is then applying color. A lot of the brown that you are seeing is actually the ground of the canvas itself. Caravaggio actually uses the ground of the canvas almost as a mid-tone, keeping it where it's appropriate. And that's one of the reasons why he was able to produce so much, is that his process was actually very economical. It was a very efficient way of working, as well as revolutionary at the time. Another thing that Caravaggio was really wonderful at, and I thought that this little segment depicted it, is a collective emotional sense with variations on individuals. So when you look at this cluster, you, without even knowing what's going on, they are all surprised. The one in the back is really intrigued. The other one is almost grossed out, kind of like looking kind of a little, wanting to turn away a little bit. So he is really almost as well as kind of showing kind of this carnal realism, is also just as much of a magician to kind of show again that intangible in the tangible, this collective sense of revelation. So, and here we have Abraham, who was tasked to sacrifice his son to test his devotion, and at the moment he's about to do so, is intervened from a divine angel saying, "Stop, you've proven yourself." And so what I really love about this composition is how Caravaggio, again, a large diagonal kind of is the spinal column of this composition, from the upper left-hand angel's face all the way down to the ram. And I love that composition of the bookending of that composition, the ram's head looking up with the divine angel looking back. And it kind with Abraham's head in the middle, almost a display of kind of the certain heavenly kingdom, the animal kingdom, humankind, and then the divine, progression upward. When we also look at the faces, like Abraham is a believable, I believe that man could walk the streets today. That he's a very, very individualized person. The angel, however, almost looks like an Apollo in terms of his profile. It's almost Grecian. It's almost, it's real, but there's a certain sense again of, so this is Caravaggio almost tipping his hat to the generation before. This is him elevating, as opposed to being faithful to nature. And again, a communicator of emotion. So here his son is not passively waiting to be sacrificed and not there just for a display. So some subject matters for artists would kind of provide opportunities for artists. So Saint Sebastian, who is often shown tied to a pole with arrows sticking out, provided artists an opportunity to render the male form. So this would have been one of those opportunities, and Rembrandt years later does take advantage of that. But if you look at the entire painting, the body is almost completely shunned, and he is all face in a scream out to us, pleading for help. Again, this participatory kind of element to his work, where you are participating in it. You are not just a voyeur. So again, like, Caravaggio just cannot be touched at this time, and even still, like there are very few that were able to communicate such a almost guttural emotion, especially this early in Western painting. So he eventually gets a large break with a commission to paint the life of Saint Matthew, and here is the first that he, I believe it's the first of the three that he painted. This is the Calling of Saint Matthew, and so here you can see Christ and off to the right-hand side, shrouded in the dark, and then you see the tax collectors over to the left, and Matthew. Now, rather than being depicted in some sort of Roman or Greek-like setting, again, in a more elevated, appropriate area, this almost looks like a tavern. This is happening in a very conventional, ordinary, everyday scene. But to Caravaggio, that is what the whole message and the scriptures were about. It was this sense of Christ kind of like going amongst the sick and the lame, not the noble and the prestigious. So as far as Caravaggio is concerned, he's perfectly in line with the tenets and really doesn't understand why they're maybe so met with such hostility. But again, a couple of things that Caravaggio was using, the shutter that is half opened, again, that is coming towards us. Again, another subtle but notable demonstration. It's also right in the middle of the canvas as well, which is also a very peculiar place to be putting such a commanding edge. It also creates a justification for the canopy that creates this shaft of light pointing us towards Matthew. Now, as I was looking at this painting, I was really taken by the hand of Jesus, and it did seem very familiar to me. And as I was looking at it longer, it actually reminded me of the other Michelangelo, and it seems almost a mirror image of the hand of Adam. Now, of course, I have no way of knowing if that is actually just coincidence or what, but I think that it does have some bearing in the overall. Rather than the charge of creation, which is what Michelangelo is communicating here as the fingers touch, it is that charge of life. Here, Caravaggio is using the hand as it clears the path of illumination of self-worth in a sense, where Matthew is pointing inward saying me, and he's saying, yes, you. So in this way, Caravaggio is using light quite as a allegory in and of itself. This is not just the light that illuminates form, it is the light that illuminates inner enlightenment as well, or just as much. So now, quick technical note, why I harp on you guys about cast shadow edges, if you look at the cast shadow edge that is right above the Christ figure, that is so important, how he is going from a sharper edge and transitioning softer and softer and softer. That is what conveys that sense of atmosphere without much more information. Okay. So the middle panel, this is the, I believe this is referred to as the inspiration of St. Matthew. And so here this is right behind the altar, so it's a very vertical piece. And here we can see St. Matthew as he's receiving the divine revelation on what to write. There is a painting of St. Matthew that was lost, unfortunately, in one of the wars, of St. Matthew writing, and I actually think that one, I feel like it's even better. But it was kind of not so popular because it shows the saint kind of almost like dumbly looking on as the angel literally guides his hand writing. But I felt like it just reads so much more intimate, but unfortunately, at cost of war. And then, of course, we come back to the image that we started off with here, which is the assassination, the death of St. Matthew. And, as I was talking earlier, we have the figures on the left that are composed in descending order, kind of like to help create the sense of motion, and the sense that the figures, again, are spilling out into our space. And even so much that the cherubs are kind of screaming in a certain sense of kind of dismay at what is about to transpire. But I think, again, what really is telling about this is that Caravaggio, the nucleus upon which this whole structure of the painting is built is the assassin himself. Almost like Caravaggio identifies more with the sinners than the saints, and so therefore it kind of is more of a central piece to him, although he is looking rather apathetically in the background. And there he is, almost doing a stink face, like, oh. So here's where they are actually in place. They are still where they were designed to be. And you can actually, it helps to give you a sense of scale of how large these works were. And so that kind of almost is more infuriating when you think about this whole 3 heads a day formula. You think of something that large.
And where is that? Rome.
Yes, this is yes, this is in Rome. Oops, wrong direction. Sorry here. And with these paintings, people flocked to see them. So it's like if this were a movie, this was a big hit. It was like, so people came and flocked all over to see these paintings. And I think that's partially because of Caravaggio's revolutionary process of working from life, from real people. Pilgrims for the first time saw themselves in altarpieces. And so it created almost, I would imagine, an intoxicating space where you yourself saw amongst the divine. And even these kind of cheeky moments of what we would now call trompe-l'oeil. If you look at the very base of, let me go back to the actual image. If you look at the very base of the stone that the stool Matthew's on, it's precariously placed over the edge, creating a cast shadow. If you look at it in real life, the stone that it's on is almost could be conceived as part of the altarpiece. So he's almost trying to, again, this barging into our reality, such an intrusiveness in a way. So now this painting is really, I think, one of the, I'm a little biased because this is one of the major works of his that I've seen in person. But this to me is really probably one of his best paintings. This really, up until this point, this is painting in 1601. He's really at the height of his popularity. He's really at the height of his powers. And there are 2 brothers that are bankers called the Mattei, and they actually are the ones who commissioned this piece. They commissioned 2, I believe, and this is just one of the 2. And this painting really is, I would say, his complete magnum opus. So all the things that we've been looking at, from the entombment with that shoulder jetting out, we can see that replicated here with the apostle on the left, that elbow that is quite, very entering our space. He's also physically bigger. If you were to take the proportions of the figure on the left and compare them with the width of the shoulders of the other figures, he physically is larger, heightening the sense of him with such a sense of surprise. He's like scooting his chair back into our space. Whenever paintings kind of go outside, it references the outside world, our world. It's not an image that is neatly contained within its designed boundaries. And again, that very almost cheeky way of demonstrating his abilities, that fruit basket, just like the stool in Matthew, is precariously placed on the edge. We almost have this sense of like, is anybody going to kind of nudge that? It seems like it could fall, which I think adds to the whole tension of the work. So the story here of the supper at Emmaus, these two men, the one in the green coat and the one with the shell on his vest, are two apostles. And after Christ's death, they are walking and come across what they think is a beggar, and they aren't aware that it is the risen Christ until they break bread with him. And once he blesses the bread, they then recognize the man that is before them was once their teacher. And so you can see with the two apostles this oh my God, I can't believe that it's you, kind of as they jump backward. And again, just like with the light of illumination that we saw with the calling of Matthew, the light of illumination is a little literal again in this instance. The man who has no idea what's going on is literally in the dark. His face is literally not turned towards the light. So he's basically almost going to say, like, what's wrong with you guys? Because he has no idea what is happening here. And the luminosity is kind of what conveys that. With the apostle on the left, the light that he is receiving is that from the tablecloth, an inner light, this inner illumination that he is having. So the light, again, is a metaphor for what is actually happening within the picture. And this is what makes Caravaggio such a poet when it comes to not only a master technician, but using technique to convey very concept ideas. And this is just one of the many reasons why he's just so amazing. I could go on and on about this painting. So this is a close-up view, and so this is him demonstrating everything that he's learned all the way from his apprentice years with those demonstration pieces of the Bacchus, the basket of fruits, all culminates in this demonstration over here. Again, with the cooked bird, and I'm not sure if you're getting the full effect of it, but you can really read the almost literal goosebumps on the actual bird, the way that it is painted. It's really just a miracle of painting. So this is actually a big close-up of the apostle that's on the right. So just to give you a greater view again, the man on the right whose arms are kind of stretched out. This is the top of his head. And so most of what you're seeing above the ear, aside these wispy highlights, the brown that you're looking at, that is the imprimatura. So the imprimatura is an Italian term which means first layer. It's basically the tone we apply to the canvas. One of Caravaggio's, now he's not the first to do this. This is also something careful to be, it's also like how Van Eyck was credited to inventing oil paint. He didn't, it was already there, but he maximized its potential. From our last discussion, we know that Titian in his mid-years did experiment with darker grounds, but it did not become part of his practice. Caravaggio is using pretty much a red ochre or an earth umber just by itself, and is starting from a very dark, almost a chocolate brown mahogany canvas. And then with white is sculpting the light forms on top of that. So almost quite literally, as the creation myth, let there be light, he is then sculpting the light amidst the darks that dominate the picture plane. And this is what helps him design his compositions and create an enormous sense of luminosity, counterintuitively enough, by starting in total darkness. So these dark linear strokes that you see, there's a dark C curve like right above the ear on the forehead, and some of the darker lines that you see towards the back of the cranium. Those are what's called the pentimenti. So if you think back to Titian's process, he also would begin in the same way. The pentimenti is basically the drawing. So he would have been using, again, a very dark earth color, and before white was introduced, would have outlined the subject and would have drawn the contours first before then bringing white to then sculpt the form. So, and again, if you look at the apostle's hair right in the center there, that is the canvas. That is the raw canvas. That is what the entire thing would have been, that tone. And then everything else would have been built up with white on top in successive layers. Now, if you look at the shoulder of the apostle, where it meets the flesh of the man, it's a little hard. You can kind of see it here. There's a brown line that you'll see. That is also the canvas. And what that is evidence of Caravaggio working from life and finishing elements in turn. So basically what he's doing is working right up to that edge, and he's like, well, I don't have the model here for the other, so I'm stopping there. So he has raw canvas separating the two. Now, in our process, I often say if I see the canvas between, you don't want that. But because it's so dark and, well, he's himself, he's Caravaggio, he can manage that a bit better. So I included this because this was one of the images that shows there is a pattern on this white linen tablecloth. And I'm not sure if you can see these very thin linear striations there. They really jump out and sing off the canvas. And Caravaggio's little trick here is he's actually mixing egg tempera in with the oil paint, and it just makes it a little bit more intense, a little bit more bright. If I also have my facts correct, this is also one of the paintings that has a little bit of an egg tempera underpainting, but I'm not sure if this is the painting, and I can't remember where if it is, so probably should not have mentioned it, but anyway. There is, just to go back to the overall picture here, there is one element about Caravaggio that I think is greatly misunderstood, which is that everybody always says that Caravaggio never drew, and that's because no drawings survive. But obviously, he's an incredibly proficient draftsman. When they did x-rays of this painting, there are no changes to it. So he must have had either done studies or was just very clear in vision when doing it. But there was one change, which is that on the bottom right-hand side, right under the basket, the apostle on the right, his knee originally jetted out from under the tablecloth. He then had second thoughts and then covered it with the patterned fabric that we now see there. That is the one major correction. In some of Caravaggio's works, and I desperately tried to find an image of this, but it is one of the few things you really can only see in person from certain angles, there are scry marks in the painting, these embedded lines, scratches that are throughout the painting, and we don't really know what their purpose is. There are a few hypotheses, one being that he scried in at the beginning of to start the drawing process, but as technicians that doesn't really make a lot of sense to do it that way. Another theory is that they are transfer marks. So when Caravaggio transferred his cartoons, the primer was still fresh, creating an indentation. That has flaws too because they don't always correspond to contours that we see. So we don't know really what they were designed for. Another more recent theory is that they were notes for Caravaggio to help position the model back into pose. But it's a bit unclear as to what the precise reason is for. It doesn't always happen, and it doesn't have a logic necessarily as to where it happens. So with this image, so again with the Christ figure, these dark lines on the right-hand side of the portrait, that is the pentimenti. This is the outline that would have been around everything before the white was made part of it. Most of the shadow on the right side is also a good portion of that is ground. Not completely, he is modeling the reflected lights, but a good portion of that is coming through. What do I have? Oh, yeah, we're not gonna get into legal troubles right now. So one of the things that I wanted to really just to briefly go back to this is that one of the many things that I've been talking about with Caravaggio is this kind of like aggressive realism and how it kind of is intrusive into our space, and how from the Bacchus kind of extending the cup, this foreshortening, to the entombment with the elbow, all of these kind of the shoulders jetting forward in some of the other Bacchus paintings. Here he is really, again, kind of heightening that. If you look at the man on the left, he is creating almost a perspective line to show you the distance, how far the far hand is and how close the other is. That arm is completely coming towards us. The hand of the figure of Jesus is also coming towards us, as is the elbow, as is the table. And I can't help but think a little bit about Apelles. I know this might seem a really far left detour here, but Apelles is a kind of an ancient Greek painter who's kind of passed into somewhat of legend. And there is something called Apelles' line, and there are kind of two definitions, but the one definition that I want to talk about is the legend of him where he said an artist must practice their form every day. And I think he's quoted as saying, "Not a day without a line." And one of his exercises would be to draw a perfect straight line freehand. That would be his daily exercise. And if I believe correctly, one of his rivals came in and drew a thinner line right over his, kind of saying, top that. And then Apelles comes back and draws a microscopic, almost unnoticeable thin line that splits both of them in half. And so it's always kind of the lesson being there's always someone greater. And the reason I'm thinking of that is Caravaggio is doing that in this. What he's doing, however, his, quote, Apelles line, his line in the sand saying, top that, this is what I can do. The Apelles line is not left to right or east to west, but it's back to front. He is demonstrating that straight lines that kind of honor the two-dimensional plane I'm not interested in. I'm interested in sculptural space. And so my mark of expertise, my Apelles line, is that of dimensionality. This is a space you enter, you don't observe. And so this painting really, also with the invitation of the objects up on the close corner there, I could go on and on about this painting. It's just like, I think I had like I didn't have much time with it. I think I had like only 45 minutes, but it was just incredible. It really is a masterpiece. Okay, so Caravaggio is famous for his bad behavior, and so I did want to kind of get into that a little bit. So these are pretty much his legal troubles. He's brought to trial around 11 times, he's arrested 7 to 8 times, and he's charged with a number of things. Sometimes variations on a theme, so carrying a sword and dagger without a license, which is very similar to like if somebody were to carry a gun without a license, although I'm not getting into that. So he's arrested for assault with a sword, assault with a dagger. I think a papal magistrate kind of accuses him of assault with a deadly weapon. I mean, so a lot of assault. He then is intercepted by police officers who initially let him go and say, okay, on your merry way. He then says, shove it up, and then starts throwing stones, and then he's arrested. And then eventually he works his way up to murder. This is actually, and I'm going to get into that in a sec. So this all kind of is partially kind of starts with Giovanni Baglioni, who again is a Caravaggist. He does emulate Caravaggio, but they hate each other. And he actually is he sues Caravaggio because he gets a commission of the Resurrection, I believe. And basically it was him over Caravaggio, and Caravaggio feels really ticked by this. And so he then starts to circulate verses of poems that make their way around the artist circle, and they really do make fun of him, and basically refers to his body parts as relating to animals, and that his canvases are only worthy to wipe your behinds with, using much more crass language, of course. And Caravaggio, ever the antagonist, when on the stand and is asked about these verses, who he authored, says, I don't know what verses you're talking about, forcing them to recite them in open court, and says, oh, those, yes, well, whoever wrote them was clearly an art critic, but but it clearly wasn't me. So very much the antagonist. Here are some examples of Baglioni's work. And so you can see a competent painter, but no Caravaggio. There is certainly a deft hand at work here, but it does not have the same caliber of Caravaggio. And here I believe this is Eros striking down kind of the temptations of carnal pleasure, I believe. Heaven and earth, yeah, that's what that is. So again, very competent, so very well executed, but not as innovative, not as sculptural as Caravaggio. And so he does take him to court, and actually is one of the many reasons he's brought on trial. So he eventually does get into a fight with a man named Ranuccio Tomassoni, and it's not really clear as to what the catalyst is for this fight. In some texts, it's over a tennis match, which was a very popular theme or theory for a long time. But with recent kind of research and things, we now think that it was over a woman who they both was a Caravaggio, one of Caravaggio's models, who they both favored, and part of the reason is where Tomasoni is how he's killed. So in their duel, he is fatally wounded by having his femoral artery punctured in an attempt, most likely, of Caravaggio trying to castrate him, but not kill him. In this time period, I should, yeah. So not that that's much better, but so Rome at this time is a very dangerous place. It is not kind of kind of like, not everyone is a genius at this time period, and it's a very dangerous, rough place. So wounds meant something. So if you were an adulterer, your face would get cut so that you were unattractive and could never do it again. So in this instance, the castration would have been an artistic statement, if you will. It was that. So he nicks the femoral artery. Tomasoni does not die outright. He bleeds out over the course of a day. I think he lives a day and dies. And so then Caravaggio was on the run. And on the run, his work changes in the sense that he actually reverts back to earlier modes of painting. Because he's on the run, he cannot afford and does not have the luxury, time-wise maybe, of having models come in regularly. So he's working from what are called types, or later in the Dutch would call tronies. They are studies that are used in place of the model themselves. So it's almost like if you guys were to use your figure drawings as a model for a painting you're doing, a very similar idea. And it's a very convenient way of working so that you can almost Frankenstein paintings together. And if you look at Caravaggio's older work, you can see certain things read very similar. They are personalized and not exactly the same, but you can almost see that they started from the same mold, in other words. So while on the run, he paints his largest piece. This is the beheading of John the Baptist, a very popular theme with Caravaggio, especially in his years on the run. And it's hard not to read into the artistic irony that he is really almost plagued with lamentations over this execution. And here it's almost really, he's laying it on quite thick. I mean, here, John the Baptist's head is not separated from his body. It's almost as if he too is bleeding out, as Tomasoni did. This work is very large. These figures are life-size, and most of it, again, if we cast our mind back to the death of the Virgin, so much of this is negative space. Again, Caravaggio being a master of the action is in the left-hand corner. There is an interaction there. There are the jailers in the jail kind of looking on, so they're kind of mirroring us. But this absence of space with just nothing but the bare ropes evokes this real bleak sense of absence. Again, the absence of material, just as almost like a composer where the silences are just as important as the notes. So now, this is one of the, if not the only work Caravaggio signs. But he signs it in the blood of John the Baptist. And you can kind of see here, John the Baptist here, you can see the puddle of blood that's murking out here. So you can start to make out the signature in the bottom left. Here's a little bit closer, and I've outlined it in the other image to try to kind of help to encourage you to see it on the left there. But again, so this is him, almost a confession of sorts. This is almost like an act of contrition where he is confessing his sins of killing, not John the Baptist, but Ranucci Tomasoni. So, and again, here is his later painting of the same subject, but this is post-decapitation. And again, it's a little bit of a recall to his earlier work, 3 heads a day, well, 4. But so it is both a recall and somewhat of an advancement here. Here, what I love particularly is that this is one of the only ones, if not his only representation, where we are being met by the woman, where she's actually she's requested this. She's requested the head of John the Baptist as her prize. And she's looking at us rather almost like regrettably or remorsefully. Again, this kind of this overwhelming sense of kind of just penitence almost. And again, the same subject. So, and this is also actually, what I love about this painting is that this is actually right beside the Supper at Emmaus in the National Gallery. And so you're seeing Caravaggio at the height of his powers, and Caravaggio, I mean, still very much a titan of painting, but towards the end here while he's on the run. Now, I was saying that there are types. So these are images that Caravaggio is working from. And you can see, if you look at the position of David, so this is David with the head of Goliath, one of his last pictures. If you just look at the pose of David, look at the executioner. Same gesture, proportions are very similar. The lighting is different. However, the toga cuts in a very similar location. So it's feasible that Caravaggio was using a cartoon, perhaps transferring it in reverse, and then using a model to sculpt the light on the armature of the transfer, if that clarifies that. And you can see that the drapery that he's wearing is very imaginative. It's not as convincing as, say, the drapery over the woman's shoulder. So this is one of his last paintings, and Caravaggio actually does die on the run. Well, actually, it's a little tragic here because he does secure a papal pardon. One of his benefactors actually clears the way for him. And so he starts to make his way back to Rome. And there's actually a mistake. He's mistaken for someone else and arrested. It's a case of misidentity there. But when he's released, the ship with all of his paintings and belongings has sailed without him. And so desperate, he then follows on foot and catches a fever and dies. And I think the priest that was with him says, without the assistance of God or man, dies alone, or something very... but he does die in a hospital bed. I think some stories have him dying in like swampy fields of malaria and stuff like that. But we don't actually really know what killed him. Some theories are lead poisoning from the use of so much lead white. A sword wound is also suggested, that he did get into another brawl and has himself a fatal wound. And in Simon Schama's lecture on Caravaggio, he really does focus on this painting, and I really kind of find it hard to top here, where he does talk about how there is such artistic poetry and irony, where the Pope literally puts a price on Caravaggio's head. And Caravaggio uses himself as the model for the head of Goliath. So in a way, he does almost turn himself in, artistically speaking. He brings the Vatican his own head in a certain way. It's hard to know if he actually planned that in a way. That, I mean, obviously not that he would meet his demise in the way he did, but that in an artistic way, he was kind of honoring the request in some way. And so here he is in all his glory. But what I love about this is that even like the attention to detail, it's a little hard to see, but the eyes are slightly pointing in different directions. This total absence of life there. It's really just a remarkable piece of painting. So here I also find it kind of poetic that on the left, again, in his earlier kind of height of his career, he's kind of looking on with apathy. And at the end of his career, he becomes the martyr in which he was so apathetic with to begin, in a way. It's kind of like his artistic journey, kind of represented here. And this is just a small detail of one of his later paintings. Some of his later paintings are a bit hard to find because they're somewhat unfinished, and they're just a little hard, or they're still in their churches, which doesn't provide ideal lighting for photography. But this is a youth posing as John the Baptist and showing that, this clearly is from, I would assume, a live model. There are too many unique attributes here to assume it's from a type or a trony. But again, showing just this masterful ability to convey a sense of flesh. Okay, so getting into the actual process that he used. So there's this painting, which is really hard, is very hard to get a good image of. This is the Martyrdom of Saint Ursula, and it's theorized to be exactly the last painting Caravaggio was working on, because it is in mid-process. So on the right, you can see Saint Ursula herself, modeled only in white. That is Caravaggio's beginning. You can see the brown all around her is the canvas. That is how dark he would have started with his imprimatura. So she is sculpted out of all white. You can see the two males. Why am I doing this? I have better. Okay, so you. Sorry, I'm like, why am I doing? So if you look at Saint Ursula on the right, you can clearly see that is him mapping his way. That is, so for those of you who have studied with me, this should look very familiar, a light and shadow pattern. You might also have a little bit of kind of like that trauma, just like, oh, when you see. So, but you can see all around the head of Saint Ursula, that brown is the ground. He is then scumbling the white to create form. So lead white is semi-transparent. And so by having the white thinner, he can create darker shades of gray, the white thicker, lighter shades of gray. So when you look at the hand of Saint Ursula, the fingers are very transparent layers of white, whereas the top of the hand, he is really concentrating with an intense level of opacity. Not chunkiness necessarily, not Rembrandtian impasto, but more like a hill that gradually rises from a plane and then goes back down to the flatness. In the two heads in the back, you can see they are a little further along in process. The man on the right has a glaze of color over. The man in the middle that you can barely make out has a glaze with some working up. The soldier on the far left is also, all of his face is pretty much the ground. Really, those light patches are the white with a glaze over the top, and that's it. So this is, again, Caravaggio stops mid-painting here. You can also see, and if you look at the sleeve of the man that comes down the painting, you'll see that the red sleeve has these white tips. That's the underpainting that he has not glazed over yet. So you can see, like, quite literally, he stopped almost, I don't know if that's where he stopped, but you can see that that has not been fully covered. So it really shows a very clear mapping out of his process in one image. So the imprimatura, so again, meaning this is also a close-up of one of the, I believe this is one of the Bacchus paintings. So he actually does get a little darker from this, to believe it or not, but this is originally what kind of the general imprimatura Caravaggio would have worked with. Semi-transparent, very dark. Sometimes it is also a little thicker to help fill in the grooves of the canvas, supplying him with a smoother surface to work on. So his palette is very conventional. So it's very limited, and most of you are familiar with working within such limitations. So lead white, lead tin yellow, yellow ochre, the usual kind of suspects, especially coming off of the Renaissance, where these pigments pretty much did not shift very much. Some of them I'm sure are regional, such as the red ochre, the earth umber. Those would have been somewhat, by today's standards, it's kind of like it varies brand to brand. Here it might have varied more by location, where they source the materials and such. So very traditional and straightforward palette. And so here's a more thorough mapping out of Caravaggio's process. So the beginnings of a glaze on the right-hand side. So after the opaque modeling of white on brown that we see in Ursula, Saint Ursula, sorry, that sounds a little Disney-ish. So then as we go up to the right here, it's almost like in process from right to left in a way. The man in the back has a glaze of color over, but has not been worked into. So Caravaggio would lay a glaze of color, would either then remove the glaze to reveal more of the underpainting to then optically mix the white through the layer, lightening it, or would paint into the glaze wet. Sometimes Caravaggio also does not even allow this white underpaint to dry completely, and the white underpainting actually mixes with these floating glazes that he's put on top, in some occasions, not always. Yeah.
How, you've mentioned that before, and I don't know, like, how tacky do you think that would have to be? Like, you know, like, is it?
Yeah. So it's a little hard to know. I think that it's hard to know if that's purposeful or it's just he's just really working rapidly, and so he ideally would have liked it to be dry. So I'm not sure how much of that is purposeful, but it certainly is dry enough that he can do that and not reactivate the white too much that it overwhelms him. So the mediums that he used were also very conventional: walnut oil, linseed oil, a lot of walnut oil, because in Italy, you're typically in a warmer climate. Walnut oil is a slower drying rate, so it keeps your window of working open for longer. So I'm not entirely sure if how much of that was intentional, but it's really not to a large extent. It's just occasionally that it's not fully dry, and so he's almost like mixing on the canvas in those instances. Yeah, it's very tricky there. Yeah. Yeah.
How would he
it's probably just an apocryphal story that he did 3 heads a day, but how would
Yeah.
he glaze?
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Well, I do have to say that painting in this time period is more formulaic than observed. So in other words, there's a certain formula that would be developed that you would maybe inherit from your master and the master apprentice relationship on how to handle flesh. So for example, um, like starting off with just a very basic set of 2 colors, and then like they canonically they'll gray off their light tones or something like that. It was more about a formulaic way to reproduce, again, conjuring images out of the head, more so than replicating reality in front of us. And so I think that while it seems a little, I do agree with you that it is probably some level of an apocryphal story when it comes to the 3 heads a day. However, given their size and the method of application, it doesn't seem totally unfeasible, but I certainly, when I encounter that, my initial instinct is to push back on that a little bit. Yeah, if not just to make me feel bad. So in ending over here with the armor of the man, which is fully realized and developed. Yeah.
So did he always put all the white down first, like just plain white as an underpainting, or did he ever do, white with colors mixed into it? Was it always the glaze of application on top, or like a mix of both at some point?
Yeah. So basically, so what I'm presenting is kind of more of a generalized application. Of course, there are some specific instances where he deviates from this kind of umbrella kind of terminology that I'm using. So for the most part, what we do know from some of the accounts of him working is that he would use the canvas as either an intermediate tone or a shadow in his paintings, and would keep it that way without changing it too much. So it does seem like a fair amount is worked out in the underpainting, and it's there's not that there's no rendering. There are certainly instances where he's making changes in later layers, almost repainting hands and things like that. So after the glaze is applied, he is working into it, very much what we would call somewhat of a second painting of sorts. But it's an as needed. With transparent layers of paint, there is a certain level of unpredictability where you are a little bit somewhat reactive. So he would put a glaze down, how does it look, and then react off of that instinct. But I do think it's safe to say that a lot of the work, especially in his earlier work where he's really, like the Supper at Emmaus, where he is like very intense with his realism, a very high degree of finish, that underpainting is probably very thorough, I would imagine, and very thought out. Not that there aren't additions and changes with opaque paint on top, but it's very firmed. So now in this painting as well that we looked at earlier, again, it's somewhat unfinished, and luckily for us, that allows us to kind of look under the hood, so to speak, to see the internal workings of the painting. So if we look at the shoulder of the soldier, you'll see here very much, again, the whole shoulder here. You can see that this, again, was modeled with white on the brown, which is actually most of the shadow that you see to the right of the shoulder. And this has had a glaze application. You can see that there is a layer of a golden yellow over the top there, and he is either removing or adding more white to pronounce the highlight on the shoulder. This is a much looser and freer Caravaggio. Again, he is a fugitive at this time. So it's not as studied and as crystallized as his earlier work, partially because of those circumstances. So in some respects, it allows us to see his inner workings better because he's somewhat hurried here. In the face, again, you can also see the white underpainting, which is starting to come through on the nostril there. You can see that dot of white is a bit strong, so like that's the white peeking through. And so on top of that, Caravaggio would either work further into it or would just repeat the process of then putting a transparent layer and then, again, what was called building up the form to completion with thicker paint. But generally, Caravaggio would have begun and finished modeling as quickly as possible. So, and in the head of John the Baptist, again, another great access point to understand his process. The beard, shadow, and hair are all the imprimatura with subtle ornamentations of either highlights or dark shadows for like individual strands. The shadow is, the edge of the face is only denoted by a little bit of red ochre that is painted on top of the imprimatura to get the reflection of the gold plate reflecting into the flesh. So again, really utilizing the tone of the canvas to do as much work as possible to carry him as far as it can.
So was Caravaggio, he couldn't have been the inventor of the super dark imprimatura.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So is it almost counterintuitive then that a lot of the French school teaches dark to light rather than rather than the light to dark, which seems to be prominent in the Italian method?
So saying light to dark is more common for Italian, dark to light is more French.
More French, yeah.
Yeah. So how does Caravaggio factor into that?
I just mean like since he works from light to dark, that's.
Oh, so like from the white of the underpainting to darker, that. Oh, I see. Yeah. So that's it. So I'm not sure if it's solely like if that application is responsible for kind of like pushing that in that trajectory. I do think that I think primarily in this instance the kind of I guess the idea of starting light and then going dark is really because the paintings are so dark. Just starting with this average dark canvas, it's quicker. It's faster. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So basically, he's like, I want most of this dark. Let's start that way. And then when it comes to then the individual lights, because you're starting so dark, you have to over-lighten so that you can then redarken with the transparent layer and then the subsequent opacity on top, essentially.
Have they ever found a Caravaggio that's like exquisitely bright?
Yeah. I mean, so like a lot of the Caravaggios, actually, I do have to say, like the Supper de Mass, it still emits that. Like, so lead white is unique in that characteristic that it almost glows at times, and his paintings do have that. They almost emit their own light. They bore their own light in a way, or they bear their own light. But I do. So there is actually one or two unfinished that I'll get where you can actually see like so in the Saint Ursula, she looks very intense and luminous, and there's an adoration of the Magi where you'll see that as well. So this is the Denial of Saint Peter, again a very late painting. And if you look at the forehead of the woman in the center who is accusing Saint Peter of being a Christian, you can see that very much the white modeling that's there. This is an overexposed photograph, so the tannish color is really that dark brown, but this does show that kind of high posterization of how strong the whites would be. St. Peter is actually in a very close position as St. Ursula, so again, somewhat of evidence of a type being used here, where the two hands are pointing inward. Ursula is doing very much a similar gesture. You can see on St. Peter's cloak, the white has been laid down. Some elements have been glazed or colored, some have not. So again, kind of a work in progress. And I believe I have a close-up here. So you can see, again, the forehead really kind of plowed on. Now, what doesn't show up is that there is a little bit of halftone work in the forehead. So there is what appears to be the white underpainting, a transparent layer on top, and then more white worked into it to show where the highlight is and subtle value transitions on top. And then, of course, the face of the soldier is mainly the imprimatura with, again, this red ochre used to suggest reflected lights. So a very economical use of painting, little bits here and there. Yeah.
So with the glazing of the fabric, where there's the white highlights, so he would have done a full white underpainting and then glazed part of it up to that.
Yes.
Then
Yeah.
done the white. Then he was going to go over the whole thing again to highlight those bright parts to make everything.
Or he most likely would have come in and darkened his darks more. So what Caravaggio would do towards the end of the painting process would augment the darks, not by painting them black completely. He's using black, but glazes of black, transparent layers of black, or black in various opacities. And that's what makes his spaces feel dense and like a space I can wander into, not a black curtain that's pulled down behind everyone kind of a thing. So actually that brings me to this one. So this is the Adoration of the Magi. And so you can see this is a very unfinished piece. The donkey, the bull, the wood paneling, the basket is all the pentimenti. This is him drawing with a brush. You can see he's masked in the shadow pattern of the donkey. He's masked in the shadow pattern of the basket and still life in the foreground. He has sculpted the figures with white. He has got what appears to be a first layer of coloring over the drapery, some of the figures less so. The figure at the very far back seems like he's got the least amount of coverage. So this again shows that inner working method. And you can see that the background, all of that would have been darkened with successive or varying levels of opacity of carbon black to get the darks to read distant and dark, but luminous enough for light to pass through. So a general overview for his method, just to kind of summarize that, is starting off with the dark imprimatura, the pentimenti, or the underdrawing, sculpting out with white, a transparent layer, the building up, and then strengthening the shadows with black. So he would go into the shadows sometimes where he kept the imprimatura preserved and would put a thin layer of black just to emphasize the punch even more. Very effective. So going back to this, I don't think this is sickly. I think this is just aged. Paint gets more transparent as time goes on. So if you look at the pale, sickly appearance of Bacchus, to me that reads like the underpainting coming through. It's not really a purposeful artistic choice. So this is where I think those, again, some apocryphal stories of like him recuperating from an accident and that accounts for the sickly appearance, I don't think is fairly accurate. And so hopefully I maybe have, not that I have any stake in this at all, but I hope I have convinced you of that too, that that's what I'm pretty sure that is. Yeah.
When I was in Rome and I saw this piece, they had actually done some restoration on it.
Oh, yeah?
That it actually was a varnish that he had used to make it look sickly.
Oh, really?
That's what made it look sickly.
Oh, that's what made it look sickly, the varnish, yeah. Oh, I see. So there was a prior restoration. Yeah, that's also very similar to the Mona Lisa, actually, because she does have a green hue to her skin, and that's from aggressive overcleaning in the past, unfortunately. I'm not sure why that's here, but yeah. So just try to do this. But Caravaggio also has followers, the Caravaggisti, which is what they're called, and contemporaries. Rubens actually, when the death of the Virgin was rejected, Rubens pleaded with his employer at the time and he begged you need to buy this. Like you need to really buy it, and was just really enamored with his work. So much that he does a copy. Here we have Caravaggio on the left, and we have Rubens' cover song of Caravaggio on the right. And you can see that it's a copy, but he has made alterations. He's removed figures, he's changed things. The figure of who I believe is John on the left in red, we see the whole figure and he's repositioned him, the woman with her arms up his back. So it's almost like a variation on a tune that he's playing. And he also has there's a cameo of Titian. The two figures in the back, the two women, are actually a quote from a Titian painting of the Deposition. So he's actually doing two copies in one. Sneaky, but actually very effective. So, and then of course in Spain we have Ribera, who kind of inherits this. So Rubens is kind of partially responsible for the germination of Caravaggism, or this use of intense shadow and light relationship to sculpt form out of two dimensions, and technically starting on dark grounds. Ribera's technique is incredibly similar. And if you do look, you can see the kind of the artistic likeness, if you will, in terms of appearance, but also in practice, but heightened. He's actually showing a light in the back. Although like Caravaggio, he's demonstrating the realism by having the whole body foreshortened. He is coming towards me from back to front, just like the arms of the apostle in the Supper at Emmaus. This is also Ribera, and I just had the fleshiness that Ribera is capable of accomplishing is just incredible. And of course, one of his most famous followers, Artemisia Gentileschi, and if this is one of the painters who, if you don't know her, you really should know her. She's worth a lecture in her own right, and is a very accomplished painter, and I think surpasses her father, and who initially taught her how to paint. But as you can see from her self-portrait, there is already a very similar a relationship to Caravaggio's appearance. No more so than in the beheading of Holofernes by Judith, which we saw earlier by Caravaggio, and you can see how she is so influenced by that. The one on the right almost could be like the Rubens, a variation on a Caravaggio. It's very similar, but it's tough work. She's rolled up her sleeves. The maid is pushing down to stop the writhing as he's kicking up, which we can see his legs kicking the covers off. Judith is kind of partially disgusted while she's in the act, this kind of grueling work of cutting the head off. And when we think back to Caravaggio's, she's a very beautiful Judith, but she's almost contemplating what she's doing. This is like she is in there sawing. And I love the hand pushing up against the maid, trying to resist, and she's forcing down. Just this. So she's taking this, again, this interaction, this almost tumultuous interaction of figures, and she's really playing that up. And this is a theme that is very, I think, was also somewhat personal to her, but that's a story for another time. But on the left, I love this one. She does this subject, and I think she does it the best. A very strange sentence I'm about to say, post-decapitation. She does images of this after the head is cut, and they're so much better because in this one, it's almost like they hear a noise. Who is that? Who's coming? They're going to find us. And so she's wrapping the head up, trying to camouflage. And of course, this gesture of hiding the flame from her face, total Caravaggio right there. And of course, Rembrandt. If you don't have Caravaggio, you don't have Rembrandt. There are differences, though. Sometimes I think they're linked a little too closely, more than they are similar, and there is a certain kind of an inheritance there. But Rembrandt uses the dark as a medium to mass as well. Caravaggio uses the dark as a flat negative to play the light volumes against. So they are similar, but they are different in some fundamental aspects on how to handle dark. Sometimes Rembrandt has more of a resemblance in theory to Leonardo in terms of this fumato and this idea of sculpting form, regardless of whether it's in the light or in the shadow. And so again, this whole marching towards us, again, this kind of Apelles line that was drawn by Caravaggio being expanded on first in Ribera and now in Rembrandt, this back to front. This painting actually was clipped. You're not actually seeing the full thing. There was actually, I think it's like a foot or so on the left, and it really was removed, and it really kind of creates this sense of a marching forward, which is kind of lessened, but nonetheless. Also, kind of a little bit about a Rembrandtian tool here is that, so the figures in the back are further coming forward in the front, and there's a shadow that slashes across them, and that kind of creates a certain sense that almost literally divides the space of foreground, closer, and back. One of Rembrandt's many inventions. Well, not inventions, but implementations. And, of course, another Rembrandt. This demonstrates the differences between them and some similarities. So if we think back to the Supper at Emmaus, the two light sources, the light of the table serving as the inner light of illumination. Here we have the inner light of illumination, which is represented by the woman stirring the fire. And then we have the man with the outside world, the light of the outside world coming in. Rembrandt is really painting a portrait of the mind. The man sitting stands for the conscious, the conscious within ourselves, consciousness itself. And the room is kind of almost like being housed within the brain. The window is kind of the almost windows to the soul, are the information from the outside world coming in, and the spiral staircase like thoughts ascending upward into the intangible. Rembrandt communicates all of that in a very domestic, approachable scene, just like Caravaggio communicated abstract concepts in a very tangible medium. And of course, this, Barg. So when you guys come into the program, one of the first things you learn to do is to discern a light from a shadow, very much in a Caravaggesque kind of way. And It is one of the fundamental building blocks that is necessary in order to create the illusion of realism, is that lights and shadows are completely separated and the values that you use in each cannot intertwine. Kind of like Romeo and Juliet, just can't cross. So in a way, you are also inherited members of the Caravaggisti. You are also kind of part of that tradition that Caravaggio has started. And so I hope that also makes your Barg work a little more bearable. That if you tell yourself that you're part of the Caravaggisti while you're doing it. But that's all that I had for you folks. So now, if any of you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything that you have. Or comments. Oh, comments. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah.
So when he was on the run,
Mm-hmm.
do you know more about that? I mean, he obviously was able to stay in one place long enough.
Yeah, so he does bounce around a little bit. He does end up in Naples, and he becomes a knight of an order, which is actually who commissions that large painting of John the Baptist. But the old Caravaggio comes out again. He gets into a fight, and then he gets thrown out of the order, and then is moved again, and that's when he starts to get word. I want to say it's actually a Medici that actually paves the way for his pardon, and he gets word of this, but it's just that too late kind of a thing. So what's unfortunately, so the circumstances as technicians, the unfortunate circumstances that surround his later works actually kind of provide the entry point for us to review his work and understand his process a bit better. But with his later life, as he starts to kind of less and less becomes, because again, he is moving a lot, he is on the run, and there's although recently actually I think they exhumed bones that they believed were Caravaggio's, and I believe they did testing on all this and stuff. I don't think there were any solid conclusions from it if it was him or not. But I think they do have them on display, so you can go see him and pay your respects. But I think that in his later work, yeah, it's really so like he does. He does have somehow he's able to regain some ground and actually get some respectability, but then he just messes it up again, and it just ultimately culminates in his death, which is somewhat mysterious. There aren't a lot of like solid facts about his passing. So, any other questions or any other? Yeah.
So with the cartoon, how does it get to like the bar, which is French?
Oh, so how does Barg relate in a sense to Caravaggio, or?
Because if he kind of started doing cartoon first, Caravaggio, how did it like get passed down?
Yeah, so that's the thing. We don't know if we it's pretty much assumed that he did not do cartoons. He just went directly to the canvas and started painting rather than what was the norm, which is to do a number of drawings to work out your thoughts, and then the drawings themselves, along with maybe some life references, become the model in which you build your painting around. And so he just scrapped that whole process and was actually more direct in a way, just like using a model, faithfully representing it, and forgoing the cartoon. That's not to say that he never used a cartoon. This is where we have no way of knowing for certain, but certainly in his prime, he really did dispense with that practice to an extent. But the cartoon otherwise is just like a very well-known practice that goes back even before Caravaggio, and it just gives you an opportunity. It's your rough draft. It's your opportunity to make mistakes, to try things out, and to play without fear of consequences of the medium and things like that. Yeah. But if you're really good like him, you don't need that. That's that kind of, yeah. Yeah.
So has he gone through phases where he fell out of favor? I mean, even after his death, where people sort of admired him, but then he fell into sort of.
So Caravaggio
obscurity.
Right after he dies, he kind of is forgotten, and then it's only really until like the 19th century, really, that he starts to kind of really start to regain that momentum of and enjoy the deserved notoriety that he has today. So he actually right away almost falls out into obscurity, even, which is strange because his effect is he really creates a new visual language, and it really changes the course of Western painting. But the founder is kind of lost in the shuffle. More so, it's like the method is. It's both very particular and universal. So you have like Georges de la Tour in France doing the same thing, but he never really saw Caravaggio. He only knows it through secondhand, but it does bear resemblance. So it's kind of a very universal look, but also very individualized at the same time. So I think that so right away, actually, strangely enough, falls right into obscurity, and then only centuries later he kind of is really resurrected. I want to say in part, and I want to say it's in part by the National Gallery, but I could be pointing the finger in the wrong direction on that. So, yeah.
You mentioned a female artist. I forget her name just now, but
Artemisia Gentileschi. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was she? I kind of missed what you were explaining about how she was like kind of not copying but following from Caravaggio's work. Was it because she was like learning something from him directly, or you said maybe something about her father? Like,
so her father was an established and well-known painter, and that's initially who she learned the basics of the craft from. But she is incredibly influenced by Caravaggio, and directly, and is just very. I think she really does the best out of all of his followers. Although he does not have an official workshop, he does not have an official school. Like Rubens has a very large workshop, almost a production line of students. Caravaggio has none of those. He has followers, and he has some informal students, people who work with him and kind of study by watching him work, but nothing formalized. I don't think his temperament agreed with that. So he doesn't have like a large workshop, but Artemisia is very much affected by that. I think also due to some of the facts around her life, she also had a certain upbringing that I think colorized her view of the world, and I think that finds its way through her work beautifully, the way Caravaggio does. Her work really is poetic, unlike whereas some of her other contemporaries who follow him, technically they're masterful. They don't have that poetry that she has, I think, and that Caravaggio certainly has too. So there is an influence there that's more direct than like Ribeiro, who's much later and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But yes, if you do not know Artemisia's work, I highly recommend that's who you look up when you go home. She really is an enormously accomplished painter, really beautiful. Where actually the MFA just recently acquired a new piece by her. I believe it's a cherub sleeping, I think.
Yeah.
And it did mention several.
Yeah, they do, and I think
they just restored her self-portrait at the London.
They did. They just restored and they reframed it and everything. It looks great. Beautiful. Yeah, I think it's a self-portrait as Saint Catherine.
Yep.
Because usually with some of the saints they have telltale accessories, and she's got the wheel that she was killed on, sort of. Any other questions? Yeah.
So a lot of like allegorical inference from paintings kind of comes from the commissions themselves, right? If it's biblical, it's going to be allegorical in a very specific sense.
Yeah.
Or was there anything written specifically by Caravaggio commenting on his own work about anything that he specifically implemented, or is that like?
I think it's inferred. It's always inferred. I don't. As far as I'm aware.
Was he specifically religious, or was he?
Oh yeah. So this is a very complicated thing, because I do feel like philosophically and artistically there is a reverence, and I do believe that in an artistic way, this whole message of the Word made flesh and the intangible made real, and his attempt at that through his own method of creation, I feel like that is very central to him. And even I just think that even his friends were bewildered how this genius and demon could inhabit the same body, because there are accounts of him working for a few nights in a row, and then he would have like this brand new outfit with a servant at his side and a sword and dagger on handle, and then would just go around picking fights for a few months, and then would go back to work. So it was somewhat cyclical. It was like, an intense period of work, and then go wild for a few months and then back and forth. So it was these two extremes, very much like his work, a high contrast, like the work himself, within his own person.
There's no diaries ever found.
No, unfortunately with him there is so little. Even his own words are so few, and they're from the trials. They're him kind of being, they're him being snippy. Like, I don't know those verses. Like, okay, that tells me a lot. It's kind of. But unfortunately, we don't have any manifestos. We don't have any writings like with Michelangelo Buonarroti. We do have that, and so we know his feelings about certain things. Or like more modern people like Rothko, who wrote a lot, and you can really understand literally what their meanings are. Caravaggio, it's more, and I think that's also partially in some respects the good thing, because it doesn't crystallize the work. It allows you to participate as he intended, to infer your own takeaways. And I think that the fact that we still walk away from his paintings enriched and in awe of nature, I think still is a testament to his mastery as a painter. Anything else? All right, well, thank you all very much for coming. I hope you found it informative. Thank you.